It's yours.
Okay. I'm Erik Olson. This is Nate Rathbun. We work for the Fish and Wildlife Service. Like Ryan said, I sit right next to him. On this particular project, I do more of the office work, and Nate spends more time in the field. So I'm going to get to talk to you about what Nate calls all the nice, pretty pictures, and then he tells me the stuff that I think is the interesting stuff.
It's interesting too. It's just not quite as pretty. Not as many colors.
So we both are working, one of these projects we're working on is using Avian radar to identify migration corridors around the shorelines of the Great Lakes. Basically, there's, let's start this way. We all know birds migrate. That's not really a big surprise. They move between spring and fall locations. But when they move, they tend to move along particular corridors when they're going from the breeding to wintering grounds. They can go a long way, up to 1,500 miles, and move pretty quickly. And then different species migrate during the day and at night. And so because there's different species at day and night, they move different locations. There can be difficulties in identifying where these migrations actually happen. At the Fish and Wildlife Service, we're concerned about birds. They're one of our trust species under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. But we also care about bats, and so we'll talk about bats somewhat as well, because some of those are trust species. Between the different types of birds, night is particularly migration of songbirds, whereas day is going to be hawks, ducks, cranes, typically larger birds that are moving during the day. And there's 4 main routes, and so the ones that we're primarily concerned about with the Great Lakes are going to be the Mississippi Flyway and part of the Atlantic Flyway. What we know is we have these nice broad areas of these flyways, but really we think that there's more specific corridors some of these birds use along the Great Lakes, that they serve as barriers or aggregators in some fashion. And we want to know a little bit more about how those migration routes, where they are, how they work, when those birds are moving through them. And one of the reasons for this is because we also work on things related to wind power, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But just for context, keep in mind that we're partially concerned about this because of how it relates to wind power and threats to birds and bats. So one of the problems with studying migration is a lot of it occurs at night. Bats pretty much entirely migrate at night. Birds, a lot of those songbirds migrate at night. It happens on a broad scale over those large areas, and we don't know a lot of the detail of where they're moving. It can happen a pulse pattern. A lot of this is because of particular weather conditions, things with barometric pressure, weather systems, stuff like that. And so you'll have times when you have a lot of migration, and then times when there isn't much during the same migration period. But it's also a somewhat short period. It's a few months long overall in the spring and the fall, but for particular species, it may be as short as a couple of weeks for a species. And so you have different species moving at different times throughout that migration period. And finally, birds and bats are just generally hard to detect sometimes. And when you couple the fact that they can be hard to detect in general, and then you're trying to look at them at night, that can be a really tricky problem if you're going out there with a pair of binoculars. So our project was intended to try and better define what's going along the shorelines of the Great Lakes, really understand in a better terms what that migration looks like. We know that there's migration occurring along these shorelines because we have lots of years of ornithologists going out there and looking at and identifying this, but we wanted to get more concrete data to really base some of this on, try and get some numbers, some more solid information to back up some of our explanation for why we have concerns about wind power, particularly along these shorelines. We also want to know how wide the corridor along the lakeshore is. The first question we're going to get when we say there's a higher concentration along those shorelines is, well, how far does it go? And the answer is we don't have a great idea, and we're hoping to get a better sense of that. We want to determine the start and ends of the migration seasons for both birds and bats as much as we can, and understand how the season changes over time in relation to weather conditions. And we really want to look at times of day and weather conditions that may elevate risk to migrants. So wind power primarily causes risk to birds and bats in an area we call the rotor swept zone, between the bottom and the top of the rotors of those wind turbines. Now, when birds and bats are migrating, sometimes they're flying above that zone, sometimes below that zone, and sometimes within that zone. And we really want to identify if there are certain times of day, certain weather conditions that concentrate large percentages of the targets in that rotor swept zone, or large numbers of them in that rotor swept zone. So our project has 4 different major components: the Avian radar units, we have acoustic and ultrasonic monitors we've set out there, We have bird surveys to go along with those, and then we also have digitized a lot of historic bird banding and other bird observation data into databases. But we're mainly just going to talk about the avian radar units and the acoustic and ultrasonic monitors today, because that's more the remote sensing side. These are our study locations here. Hopefully, you can see all the triangles represent places we've had our avian radar units over the last couple of years. We have 2 units, and we've moved them every season, and a couple of times within season. And I don't know how well you can really see in there, but there's some green dots all along in here and up and down over here. Those represent places that we've set out our acoustic monitors or ultrasonic monitors at one point in time or another throughout the same last couple of years. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the radar. There's a couple of different types of radar. A lot of people, when they think about bird radar, sometimes go to NexRad because they've heard that NexRad has been used to identify bird migrations. And it has been used for that. But there's also other types like the marine avian radar that we're using. And there's some differences between them, and I'm not going to go through all this stuff. But there are some advantages and disadvantages to NexRad. One of the big advantages is it has a wide area that it can identify stuff, but it's not very good at giving you fine detail and high resolution on what's happening in a particular area. And that was really more what we were trying to get at along these shorelines of what's really happening in a finer detail. And then the other problem with NexRad is they're fixed at certain base stations so that you can't move them around and go wherever you want. You get the data where it is. And we really wanted some ability to go out and pick and choose where we wanted to learn more information. So, like I was saying, we really like that smaller scale. We can track individual birds or small flocks on our radar, or bats. I keep saying birds, but it's birds and bats. Unfortunately, our radar cannot tell the difference between birds or bats yet. They're both little blips. But we can track individuals moving across our target area, so we can identify things like what flight they're high, or what height they're flying at, what direction they're flying, whether they're turning, and those are really useful pieces of information for us to try and identify how they're using that shoreline. And so we have better resolution also in that rotor swept zone, that 30 meters to 130 meters, than what you would get with something like NexRad, which covers a broad scope but doesn't necessarily cover that area near the ground very well. And then we have that mobility. We can put the radar units where we want them. We can set them out. First of all, we can put them exactly where we want to do a study, and then we can adjust them and move them, even just 2 or 3 feet, if that helps us reduce our interference at a particular location, which sometimes just moving a foot or 2 will make that difference. So this is what our avian radar units look like. We have 2 antennas on here. This is a horizontal antenna here, and this is the vertical antenna. They're both essentially the same thing, except we've got the vertical has been flipped on its side 90 degrees so that it sweeps upward into the air, so that it's got this upward sweep instead of the sideways sweep. And then we have this nice little trailer here where Nate can spend his time and be out of the elements and enjoy the air conditioning. And that has a number of computers to do processing and a SQL server in there. So we really actually need the air conditioning in there.
It's not for me, it's for the computers.
That's true. So the radar units we got were based on marine radar. Those are initially off-the-shelf marine radar units that you could buy to put on a ship, but they've been modified somewhat by the company that produced it. They've done a lot of work with software and a little work with the hardware. So those are S-band radars. Now some folks who use avian radar use X-band, particularly on the vertical. We chose to go with the S-band because it's got the 10 centimeter wavelength. It reduces our pickups of insects and weather-related events, so we get a better sense of what's going on when there's rain going on out there, which was one of the things we were concerned about is, are there still movements of targets when there's light rain, things like that. There's a downside that we don't necessarily see as many targets as you would pick up on the X-band, but as we get through, you'll see we think we're getting pretty good coverage and seeing some targets anyway. Our horizontal antenna has Doppler on it, the vertical does not. That's primarily because the Doppler is helping us reduce the clutter and interference that we're seeing from trees and other ground features. Because the vertical is primarily pointed up at the sky, we don't have so many problems with that clutter, so we didn't think it was worth the additional expense of the Doppler on the vertical antenna. And then we have a beam width of about 26 degrees. There's some other types of avian radars that have been developed, pencil beam radars and things like that. We wanted this larger beam width because we wanted to survey a larger volume and get longer tracks of things moving through the airspace is what we were hoping to get, even though we know we don't necessarily get as much precision on some of the information we have. Oop, went too far. Yeah, sorry. This is some raw radar video, or what we call the raw radar video. This is the returns we're getting out of the antenna. So what you're seeing on the left is our horizontal antenna, the right is our vertical antenna. On the left, these white spaces in here, that's all the clutter that you see from trees, buildings, all that sort of stuff around the radar unit. The radar unit would be in the dead center of that image. And all these white things you see moving through are targets. Birds or bats or something moving through in the middle of the night. Over here on the right, the radar is centered right down here, and this low, that area there is where we're getting interference, and this over here is stuff along the ground. All these things moving through down here, or occasionally you'll see something moving through up there, those are all targets that we're seeing. This is the raw stuff that comes out of the radar from those antennae, but we have it processed in real time. Those computers on there do real-time processing to convert these into vectors that we store in a SQL database. So we take the SQL database and we can plot those out on these images. And so this on the left is an image of that horizontal radar that aggregates an hour's worth of tracks, all on top of a ground map there. And on the right, this is what an hour's worth of what we saw on the vertical radar shows up as. And so then we can see the different elevation bands over here that goes up to about 3,000 meters. Is that right? About 3,000 meters. And then over here, the area out here from the center to the edge is about 2 nautical miles. And over here, we have a little bit different range on the vertical. So it's about 1.5 nautical miles up, but it's 0.75 nautical miles out to the side. So this is an example of just one of the track plots. This would be in the middle of the day where we don't have a lot of activity. We have 38 targets here and about 2,000 targets over on the horizontal. And this white line represents the orientation of where that vertical antenna is pointing. We get different returns on the vertical depending on what direction the targets are moving. And that's why we want both horizontal and vertical. They give us different types of information. I want to point out this color wheel up here. That's useful because the digital process plots tracks together into a sequence and identifies when you have multiple plots in a row and makes a line out of it and says this is all one target. Well, what these colors represent on these images is the directionality of those targets. So if it's red, it's something that's likely moving south. If it's blue, it's something moving north. And the purple and green represent it moving west or east over on the horizontal, or on the vertical, it's just indicates left to right because it depends what way that's oriented. So this is a 24-hour sequence of hourly groupings that just shows you how the things change from day to night. And this is nighttime where you see the migration going on. And then how it settles back down toward dawn. And you can see that we see different height profiles at different times. We see different numbers of targets certainly moving through. But the other thing I want to point out is over here, this is the Lake Michigan shoreline right here. This is a site in Wisconsin. And you'll see at night, we get tons of targets all over the place. And this is very red and yellow. They're all moving south. Toward the end of the night right here, it turns pinkish because they're all moving westward in off of the lake to land on shore. And so we can see those sorts of details about how the birds are moving differently at different times of night and within different parts of our radar scope, which is only a couple of miles along that shoreline. Now Nate's going to talk about some of the results.
Less of the pretty stuff. But if you took all of what Eric showed you on that last one and took all the numbers from it rather than plotting it out as tracks, you can see a graph of activity like this. This is over an average. If you start out at noon, you end up with not a whole lot of activity. But as you increase towards dusk, or as you go towards dusk, the activity increases, peaks around midnight, and then decreases as you get towards dawn, ends up back there at noon again, not a whole lot of activity. So this is our big migration time is during that nighttime. If you spread this out over the whole season, instead of rather looking at 24 hours of it, you can see there's many different peaks and valleys, that peak pattern we talked about before. You can also see a variety of different size peaks. There's some that are really big. Those are our major migration nights, and there's other ones that are a little bit smaller but still seem to have a lot of activity going on. This is just from one of our radar antennas. You can see different waves of migration that come through. There's a big week-long or week-and-a-half-long period here where it's migration is going every single night. But then as you get towards the end of the season in the fall, you get more periodic, where there's more gaps, where it's maybe one night out of that week where migration occurs. If we put the other radar antenna on here with their counts, everything looks a little messy. So we're going to spread this out a little bit, zoom in on 2 different areas. Zoom in on the big migration area where a lot's going on, and then toward the end of the season, back towards November where there's not as much going on, to see what differences and patterns we see. Up here on the top, this is migration from that first period. These vertical lines are midnight, so matching up with what we saw before, lots of activity on both the horizontal and vertical radars going on at that time, lots of targets moving through, all starting out right at dusk, increasing towards midnight and decreasing At dawn, if we look at the end of migration, we'll see there's lots of peaks in here, but they're not right at midnight. They're actually at dusk and dawn, and this indicates gulls or geese or things moving back and forth between breeding locations and roosting locations, and not a whole lot going on the vertical radar. So looking at the pattern is something that's really important rather than looking at just the numbers from this. Speaking about a little bit closer in area that we were looking at Michigan before. This is from Wisconsin. This is from this past fall. We started out in August. There's not a whole lot going on up until about the 20th, and then migration really starts occurring on both the horizontal and the vertical radars. Migration starts occurring, goes pretty hard for a while, and then ends up stopping, apparently, and then we picked it up again here at the end of, in the middle of October. You might have paid attention to the news there. There were some big things going on. This is actually the government shutdown, so we weren't running the radar. But the birds are migrating. They don't pay attention to that. So we don't know what was going on there, but we think there's still migration occurring. But we'll just have to see what type of pattern we can find. As you get more towards the end of migration, over in Wisconsin, early November, things get pretty periodic where there's one migration night a week, and then all the way out through Thanksgiving, there's not a whole lot going on towards that end. So this is what migration looked like this fall. We can do this for all the seasons that we've been out there. We've been out there a bunch. And then we've also had our acoustic monitors out there spread all around. We only have 2 mobile radar units, but we have something like 40 acoustic monitors that we can put out different places, get different people to watch them. They're a little bit easier to have out there, but they don't give us quite the same data. Can't really see that on this screen. Anyway, but if you remember from before, lots of green dots, not a whole lot of triangles for the radar units. This is our acoustic monitor. Here on the left, up at the top is the bird mic. That's listening for audible calls from birds. Not listening for their song that's only on at night, but it's listening for the flight calls as they're flying over and migrating, listening for those. Over here is the bat mic. It's down here on too, but it's a little harder to see. And that has an ultrasonic microphone that's listening for the echolocation calls that bats are giving as they're moving through an area, searching for food, and just looking to not run into trees. So the different call types we're looking at: acoustic bird calls. They're audible and they're used for communication between birds in flight. So if there's a group of birds that all leaves one area, they sort of want to end up in the same area as well. So they give these little calls periodically to make sure they're all going the same direction, the same speed, and they don't run into each other. So this is an example of a call, little sort of a buzz going through. You can hear these if you listen at night and you're really good and you're really lucky. I haven't heard any, but if you're better than I am. Anyway, ultrasonic bat calls, they're inaudible, they're really high frequency. These are the echolocation calls, and they're used to navigate and feed in the dark. So they give them periodically as they fly, get a different picture of their environment. Some of the advantages of acoustic monitoring: you can have continuous monitoring. They're out there, you set them out. As long as you keep changing the batteries, they're out there listening. It's possible to identify birds and bats to species, so you can tell what exactly is going on out there. Whereas with our radar units, you can't quite tell that. It'll tell you that there is something out there, but not that it's an eagle, or that it's a warbler, or that it's a little brown bat, where you can do this with the acoustic monitors. So we often pair them up. You can see in the back there's a little bat, that's the radar unit. We'll pair them up with the acoustic monitors and the radar to try and get a better, broader picture of what's going on in an area. And they're also pretty cheap relatively, and easy to maintain and set up. If you get a volunteer and somebody to change battery once a week or once every 2 weeks. Some of the disadvantages: they're pretty short range, only about 100 meters, 100 meters, whereas our radar units have that 2 nautical mile range on the horizontal anyway. And they may be affected more because of the short range by the local habitat in an area. So if we look at our acoustic calls and we categorize, just looking at the bat calls from an area, that's where our focus has mainly been. If you quantify all these up, see how many bats are in an area that have been calling, plot these out using GIS, and go through and play a movie, you can see some sort of patterns start to emerge. Not quite as dramatic as the ones you saw with the radar units, but we'll try and show you one here. Yeah, if you want to push the button or the play, whichever. It'll be here sometime. Circles will start getting bigger. Maybe. Oh, there we go. Okay. So So as these bigger circles are more calls. This is on Lake Erie, so it's on an east-west lake shore. But as you see coming up here, if you start out looking at this one, this next one, there's a big peak there, or a bigger peak, moves over there, next one's gonna be up there. And then this next night, a lot more of them pick up. You can see that all at once, it was a good migration night or a good feeding night on that side of the lake. So you can start to pick up some smaller patterns from this. We've got a much longer movie. This is just 2 minutes for this presentation, but if you start staring at it long enough, patterns come out of you too. And then you can look at the numbers and see them as well. So our project is a collaboration between Region 3, so the Midwest region, and the Northeast region of the Fish and Wildlife Service. There's the rest of our team. And we work pretty closely with the University of Minnesota and USGS, especially with the acoustic monitoring, trying to get our calls identified. And if you want to check out more of our project, see some more data, see those cool movies again, or just figure out how to email us, you can go to our website and check us out. And our funding for our project is provided by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, so without them, I wouldn't be here. Eric probably still wouldn't be here. Anyway. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, we're happy to have them. Try and answer them anyway.
Any physics questions? Jim?
I don't know, you're putting me on the spot now.
So how do you decide where to put the radar?
Well, there's two different pieces to it. First, there's the initial question of where do we want to do a study, where are we interested in finding stuff. So we started out, for example, looking at the lake shores of Lake Michigan because they're north-south. They seem the most obvious, easy way to see if there's really differences or what's going on. But we're trying to hit all the Great Lakes. You might notice from the map that we haven't done Lake Superior yet. Part of that is because there has not been a lot of wind development pressure along Lake Superior. Almost all of the other lakes have some, Ontario doesn't have a lot, but almost all the rest have some pressure right along the shoreline or immediately offshore for potential wind development. And so we're trying to get a sample of as much as we can. If you look at where we have 2 sites on Lake Erie, the idea is we're hoping we can take what we get from those 2 sites and extrapolate more to cover a larger portion of that shoreline. The same thing with Lake Michigan, and say we think it's a north-south shoreline, it's probably similar up and down most of the shoreline. And then the other piece is once we identify an area that we think is a general study area, then we do a little bit of desktop GIS analysis, but then we also have people just really go out and drive up and down and find ideal sites. There's a lot of stuff that goes into picking a good radar site where you're not going to have too much interference, too much clutter. It's going to be the right distance from the shoreline, stuff like that. The desktop GIS has not really done a good enough job to get us there, and really having people in the field driving up and down looking for the sites has been more effective at this point.
We'll tow the radars behind us and stick them in a field and see how it works. So that's how we figured out what a good and bad location are too.
Other questions?
Yep.
Do you see any of the bat nose fungus around?
We don't see it in, because I'm not in caves, but our bat biologist isn't here, but he's seen it plenty. I know from when he was looking at the acoustic calls up here in New York versus other ones around the Great Lakes, that the bat calls up in that New York area were greatly reduced because of their population declines from white nose syndrome. You don't know what it is, it's a plague for bats, but it's a fungus. So big population crashes and endangered species and all that fun stuff. But we're not necessarily going out there looking in caves for it. And also there's the migratory bats that are most of the ones that we might pick up or be most concerned with wind power aren't the ones that are being hit by white nose syndrome. So there's a little bit of a difference there. They don't live in caves. They migrate south. So.
With the bats, there's sort of 2 distinct groups, the migratory bats and the cave bats. And the cave bats are the ones primarily getting hit by white nose syndrome. They're also the ones that are currently our trust species that either are listed or that we're proposing for listing. It's the migratory ones that are in a lot of ways having bigger impacts from wind power. And so that's more of a long-term problem. And we're trying to really keep both in mind and address both as best we can. But they act differently, and so there's only so much you can do for either or both.
That's some of why identifying them with acoustic monitors and which bat species it is important for us.
I was just going to add on to that and ask if there's any particular bird species of interest based on their flying height characteristics or maybe a protective status that you guys have singled out as being a particular interest in the study.
Well, it's the most easiest, I guess the easiest species for us to filter out might be some of the diurnal migrants, the hawks and things, based on the flight characteristics and time. But a lot of that gets clouded by daytime activity, and you saw the nighttime activity was much bigger. So it's harder for us to tell which species of birds is coming through than the bats. There's many, many more species of birds to identify from an acoustic monitor, whereas there's 10 species of bats there might be, so your options are a lot more limited for it. Bats also tend to call a lot more, so you get more of those calls too. So not as much focused on a single species of birds, but there are endangered species in those areas. Piping plover, Kirtland's warblers in Michigan.
And we also pay attention to eagles, even though
Yep.
they're not endangered. That's also a concern for us. But the radar project hasn't done a lot of identifying specific species at this point. We would love to get there eventually. There is some discussion that at some point you may be able to look at some of those tracks and pull out characteristics to identify what's what, but we're probably a long way from actually doing that.
Yeah, we'll get there eventually, but whether I'm still here, who knows?
Which species is doing 500 miles in a day and at 50 miles an hour?
Well, they not necessarily the same species
Okay.
that do that, but 50 miles an hour is usually ducks that are flying pretty fast, and the longer migrants are ones that go from Alaska to all the way down to Argentina or so,
That's
in
the
the
old ones,
U.S. So there's seabirds that go crazy far just all the time, so never land.
Any last questions? Go ahead, Mayor.
You got to do it.
I wanted to know if there's any effect of the radar on the bats. And I could go through the hand motions like, oh, I don't feel so good.
That's acceptable, Barry.
Yeah. As far as I know, there's only one study that's really looked at that or considered it very much. So for the most part, radar's used to look at birds and bats, and people have generally assumed there aren't any effects. I've seen one study that said that there may be some effects from radar actually causing them to heat up, that it heats the membranes in their wings a little bit, and would actually bother them a little bit and cause them to fly away from the radar and just alter their behavior slightly. It doesn't sound like there's any harm permanently, but it would just cause them to not want to come near the radar, is the idea. But I don't remember off the top of my head. I think that was a NexRad type radar, and I'm not sure exactly whether anyone's looked into what the different wavelengths have to do with it, or what kind of, how your different configurations would make a difference. The other thing is it probably depends a lot on the power that you're using, and the ones that we have are actually fairly low power relative to what has historically been used. They're solid state, and they don't need a whole lot of power to get the returns that we're getting, compared to what people were using just 5 or 10 years ago.
Do I have time for one more question, or should I ask them afterwards?
So you can ask. Go ahead. Maybe the last one.
For the acoustic things, what does it sound like? And do you have to do like ground truth, to see what a robin sounds like?
For the acoustic monitors, there's some libraries that have been built up of calls, so of different species of birds and especially different species of bats. With the bats, there's actually automated filters that you can run through, and they're varying levels of success, but you can run them through and it'll tell you this is a bat call, and tell you it's a little brown bat or a northern long-eared or whatever. With the bird calls, because there's so many more of them, it's a little bit harder. You have to go through manually usually and do that, but there's people that do that as well. So they've gone out and recorded that, so they know what's going on. But for the radar units, we do some ground truthing to say, all right, this is a vulture flying through. It's a lot harder to do it at night. You can't do it at night, but during the day we've done a lot of that. We'd say this is a flock of blackbirds, or this is 3 turkey vultures that are flying through, so we can at least get some of an idea that they are tracking birds and bats. It's not tracking leaves blowing in the wind either, so.
So Nate, how many people think you work for the NSA for the conversation?
We get plenty of fun stuff with these when we put them out there. People think it's a wind turbine. Yeah, we got NSA, especially this past fall. I tell people it's a popcorn maker, so they don't believe me most of the time. But yeah, I want to know where the popcorn is. But yeah, that's what's actually in the big box. And just
Well, you guys have a lot of time to think about those answers, don't you, when you're out there? 24/7
Yep.
away.
You're sitting in the middle of the field looking for birds to fly by. So.
Anyways, at the end, you can also ask more questions as it comes to you, and they will give you their phone numbers and emails, I'm sure, as you ponder this.
We'll give you
Anyways,
Jeff's phone
let's give them a round of applause.